Is criticism of the economy disinformation or misinformation? According to many people, it actually is. But the very fact that they have to assign that term, call it misinformation, shows you just how widespread criticism must be. And it's not just polling data. We're seeing this across a number of different counts. That's why they're talking about social media being infiltrated with criticism of the economy. I'll give you a perfect example. Last month, Congressman James Clyburn was on MSNBC, and he was asked about a focus group which had a whole lot that was not good to say about the economic situation. And Clyburn's response was, what we've got to do is make sure that people see the policies of the Biden administration, how they affect their everyday lives, and get them to see his policies, that which is real, not what they may hear or on social media. One of the focus group people talked about social media and the misrepresentation, disinformation, all of those things that are out there. And that's the battle that we have to fight. And we've got to do a better job of fighting it more effectively. Basically, if you're saying the economy's not good, the government has a lot to talk to you about, because according to them, it's actually working really well. And one of the comments from the focus group participants was, I think, a perfect encapsulation of everything that we're talking about here. Some of the data looks really good, although a little bit less recently. But as far as most people, I would say most people's experience in the economy, they're not seeing this. This is a voter from Michigan. The point is, Biden needs to hear the people, because when he's talking about the economy doing stellar, he's talking about the stock market. He's not looking at homelessness or joblessness. He's not thinking about how much it costs to the grocery store. He's gaslighting literally everyone in the process. And so we're at extreme odds. The stock market is absolutely booming, all-time highs, Nvidia, AI bubble, all of that. And most Americans are over here saying, I just don't see it. Why is the stock market so high? Because I'm not seeing anything close to that. Sure, GDP looked pretty good in the payroll report, but my own personal experience does not align with this mainstream narrative. So, Steve and Metre, let me ask you the question. Is this actually gaslighting? Or what is really to blame for this major difference here? It's not like just a small difference. It's like a huge chasm in between these positions. The economy's booming, so says Jay Powell in the stock market. And most regular folks are like, we just don't see it.
But Jeff, it's not just the regular folks. I mean, what have we heard? Walmart says rich people trading down. Burger King just a couple of days ago said, hey, you know what, McDonald's, you want a $5 value meal? We got it right here for you. What did I just read before I went to show? Stellantis, the auto dealer, all the dealers went to the manufacturer and said, look, we've got 3 months of inventory. We can't sell cars. You need to do something. You need to give us incentives, cut prices. This is not going well. So there's this whole two-sided economy. You've got the stock market is booming. Shouldn't you feel rich and go out and spend money? Because look, hey, there's more millionaires in their 401ks now than ever. And at the other side is you have everybody struggling day to day. Something here is not adding up at all in terms of the narrative of what is the real economy.
Yeah, where is the wealth effect, right? Because at the very least, you can look at it one of two ways. You can look at the stock market as saying it's validating the idea the economy is booming, because we're all taught to believe that the stock market is a discounting mechanism, which we're both shaking our heads and laughing at. But the stock market is a discounting mechanism, talking about earnings potential, which is driven by economic growth and potential and all of that nonsense. So supposedly the stock market is reflecting the booming economy. But even if it's not, and we know it's not, even if it's not, what about the flip side of that? Because the Federal Reserve, and therefore mainstream economics, believes that there has to be some kind of positive impact from high share prices. So whether the stock market's rising for whatever reason doesn't matter. The fact that share prices are up, that means that most people look at their monthly brokerage statement and say, oh, I have more assets, I'm more wealthy. Why don't I go out and buy that thing that I've always wanted? My retirement looks better and better by the day. You just brought up what is that recent statistic? There's more millionaire 401kers than ever before, thanks to Wall Street. So where is the wealth effect? Because we're not seeing it in any of the recent data, stories, corporate earnings themselves. Companies are saying consumers are struggling. So the stock market doesn't really add up on either account, which just leaves more people to wonder, a bigger divide, not just a political divide, but really it's gone way beyond class divide. You even said it, we talked about this in a recent video about Walmart saying, our biggest growth factor comes from people who make $100,000 or more. So it is a widespread feeling that this is not a booming economy.
Well, yeah, Jeff, exactly. Because you look at the stock market, 90% of stocks are owned by 10% of the people. So that means 90% of the people own, well, 10% of the stocks. They're not really participating. So if you go out and someone's like, man, I'm getting richer and I feel better and I'm, making 10% on a big pop on Nvidia the other night. Well, that's great. But everybody else is saying, hey, you know what? I got to start shopping at Walmart because if I could save $50 a month on my groceries, well, I need to do that because my insurance costs just went up by triple that. And so we're seeing, again, these definite two sides of the economy. And the real part of the economy is telling us that we are not booming at all. And so it's just strange that we're hearing this from the administration about how great things are. But I get it from their perspective. They have to say that because if you think about this, Jeff, could you imagine anybody that, whether they're a president or a member of the Federal Reserve, came and says, hey, you know what, in 3 months we're going to be in recession, is really ugly. You know what happened to spending? It would just grind to an immediate halt. Stocks would sell out, panic would ensue. So they can't. They have to keep the narrative going no matter what's really happening.
That's the other big part of this too, right? Because so much of this is about psychology. They have to lie to you. They absolutely have to lie to you. Otherwise, the alternative, at least according to their worldview, is much worse. They would rather lie to your face and tell you everything is fine than admit the truth and risk it becoming not fine real quickly. And you're right, Steve, this is a bipartisan thing that happens. It doesn't matter who's in the White House or who's in Congress. They always tell you things are absolutely perfect and great and awesome. It's just that I think the divide between reality and the political driven perception, especially as in the Federal Reserve talking about how great the labor market is, and people are like, what are you talking about? This divide may be as large as we've ever seen it and ever experienced it. And it leads in a whole bunch of unproductive directions, including, here's another one that we and I have been talking about, the Federal Reserve. Okay, the economy isn't going great, but we have this independent agency that can fix everything. You're complaining about consumer prices? Well, these guys know exactly what to do with consumer prices. And then what happens? One of the presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank's branches comes out and says, our rate hikes don't seem to be working like they used to. So it's the economy's great, but we can fix it. But now we're not really sure we can fix it because it doesn't seem to be working the way we like it to.
Jeff, that quote was one of the most ridiculous things I've heard from the Federal Reserve. And granted, they say a lot of ridiculous things all the time, but this is great. It's like, hey, all of a sudden, monetary policy isn't working at the rate we expected it to. And maybe it's because it doesn't do anything at all. And there's kind of like partially admitting to us here that the real truth is they have absolutely no control over consumer prices, which of course you and I know. But if they keep telling the general public and they tell Congress and the president, yes, we have control of this, people believe it. And that's really what we're hearing from the elite at this time is, if you just believe the economy is good and your business is going to be good, then it's okay. You can go take your family on that vacation, buy that car you need, do those home repairs, spend the money. In a sense, that's exactly what needs to happen, is if people believe everything's okay and they go borrow and spend money, then all of a sudden that money creation, that money get injected in the economy, next thing you know, it magically works. But this all comes back to, you see an employee go to work and he sees business slow down and he gets worried. He's going to lose his job, get his hours cut. And the boss says, hey, don't worry. It's okay. Your job's safe and you can go spend some money if you need to. And then they do. And then they get fired because the economy slows down. That's the challenge here, is people are seeing what's really going on and they're starting to get nervous. And when that happens, there's a natural thing that occurs. You start saving money, particularly when you look at the savings rate right now, Jeff, which is so low historically. It tells us at some point the spending is going to stop, the savings got to go up. And that means the economy, well, inflation comes down and we're off into a recession.
Well, the thing that bothered me about Bostic's comments was that he basically admitted the truth, like you're saying. He said, the quote was, the first quarter of 2024, inflation basically went sideways. The last couple of numbers suggest that maybe we moved past that and inflation is continuing back on its path to 2%, but it's going slow. And what he was admitting was data dependency, right? But when we hear the term data dependency, we expect that these economists and policymakers are back in their room somewhere, crunching numbers, looking through all of the data, coming up with useful insights about how these processes work. What he's basically saying is, we look at each CPI coming in, and then we look at the headline and say, was that what we expected? And then we wait for the next one to come in. He's basically admitted there's absolutely no insight to any of this. They're just waiting for the next BLS report, and then they're going to react to it. That's not data dependency, as most people understand it. And of course, then it feeds into this economic divide on how the economy is perceived, and regular people versus what can we do about it. And you have all of these bureaucrats running around saying either the economy is just fine, or now they're saying, well, we don't really understand what's happening. We're going to wait for the next CPI report. And it leads into more and more dissatisfaction and all of the negative consequences that we've been trying to deal with for however long. They're getting worse because of this. This economic divide isn't just some kind of academic or social media disinformation issue. It's a very real thing. And it's a real thing largely because they have to tell you everything is good because they don't know what else to say.
Well, not only do they not know what else to say, they don't know what else to do. And if the funds rate actually had some control over inflation, well, it'd be really easy. We could just abolish the FOMC board, because what I would do, Jeff, is I would just say, hey, the federal funds rate is now tied to the CPI or core CPI. You can pick whichever one you want. It doesn't matter. We're going to tie it to the CPI. So when the CPI goes up, the funds rate goes up. When it goes down, it goes down. And we would see that linear progression. But one of the challenges that I have, and I like to tell people, run a chart of the CPI against the funds rate. Because if the Fed was true to their word, and mind you, they're not, you would see a very strong correlation between inflation and the funds rate. And yet, time and time again, you see the Fed cutting rates into rising inflation as we head into a recession, because if the precious banking system or something else goes wrong, next thing you know, they're forced to cut. So how does anybody actually believe them when they don't even believe themselves? And as you pointed out, their data dependency is ridiculous. They're just data reactionary.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Bostic actually does believe it, because that's kind of what he was saying, right? I mean, he has to be aware that there's no correlation to the federal funds rate. And so I think what he was basically saying is that, in very broad terms, what we see is that usually during periods when the Fed is hiking rates, consumer prices tend to come down. They never go into causation. They're just assuming that the funds rate caused it, even though the correlation is really thin when you actually run the numbers. It's not really difficult to do. So what they're basically saying is, we're going to take credit for those periods and just assume that it's going to work that way every time. And here's Bostic saying, well, this time it doesn't seem to be working in that way, because it's not these federal funds hikes that are controlling the consumer price environment. I can talk. It's, a number of factors. It's, first of all, the supply shock. We're still in the aftermath of the supply shock, and that takes its own time. It's on its own schedule. And let's not forget, the biggest component in any CPI is usually energy. And energy is up and down based on factors that have nothing to do with the U.S. economy. So why would you ever tie rate hikes in the federal funds rate to what OPEC and Saudi Arabia is doing? That's just absolute madness. But again, it feeds into this divide because people are paying more for gasoline, and they expect Jay Powell to do something about it, or Raphael Bostic to do something about it, because Jay Powell and Raphael Bostic have said we can do something about it. It is just a complete and utter mess, and it's leading us into no good direction.
It's funny that you say that, Jeff, because it's almost like the Fed talks themselves into the problem that they're trying to solve. It's just not working at all. But the supply shock was naturally going to fix itself. I mean, what are we seeing now? We see Tesla, too much inventory. Stellantis, too much inventory. Walmart, Target, hey, we got to cut prices here. McDonald's, hey, we have a problem too. We have inventory, but we don't have customers, so we have to cut prices. So it was just a matter of time before supply caught up with demand. In fact, looking kind of around the world, at least with China's ability to now dump things onto the global economy, you start to get the distinct impression, particularly with tariffs coming into focus now, is it tells you that even those on the very top of the political spectrum know something's going wrong. Because if the economy was booming and there was all this consumption and demand, then it wouldn't matter if, say, China was overproducing. You say, hey, you know what? Bring your stuff over here. It'll bring some more competition, maybe keep prices low. But instead, you start to see, hey, this talk of tariffs and all of that, because it's all protectionism. Because if you bring in all these cheap goods into a weak economy, it leads to job losses and further weakness.
Yeah, I said in a recent video about China dumping that they're setting China up to be the bad guy here. What they're saying is the economy's booming. It's doing really well. We did a great job making this huge economy that's really strong and resilient. Oh crap, China just broke it. That's what they're really trying to say here is that we have this really strong economy, but it's so weak that China dumping a few goods and stealing whatnot is actually that's what happened. We were doing really well until China messed it all up. At least I think that's part of it. I also think that they still have the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell's neck in the noose in case it goes wrong and sideways in that direction too. They haven't been able to do that because the CPIs are too sticky at this point. But you're right. When you look around the consumer economy, the business economy, Steve, you get the same impression. Everybody's talking about cutting prices. I got too much stuff. The only places where you see that not happening are either in the CPI sense, in rents, which that's not real. In fact, the BLS came out earlier this year and said that big spike in rent in January, that was us just changing our weighting of single family detached homes. It was completely fake and artificial. So that's the biggest contributor to CPI. And then the other one is gasoline, which, as we know, gasoline prices are going down. Demand is weak. Everyone else is cutting prices because there's no demand. And yet, Bostic and everyone else is sitting here saying, we're not really sure what's going on with consumer prices. They're so data dependent, it's almost disinformation.
Well, absolutely. And you kind of, if you look at the economy, what do we see from the ISM on the services side? Hours are getting cut. Now, that makes absolutely no sense. We're heading into the summer. This should be the boom time for the services industry. And yet, even they're saying, hey, you know what? We're noticing a slowdown where we've got to cut hours. So it comes back to what really is the Federal Reserve looking at? I mean, if they're data dependent, they're getting all of this survey right from their own backyard, their own, reports are coming out and saying, hey, things aren't that great. No, but inflation is still up. It still could go higher. There's still problems here. We need to keep the funds rate up. It's almost like they need to do this to keep the mystique of themselves actually looking good, to say, hey, we did solve the problem. And then, of course, as you mentioned, everybody's looking for a scapegoat, and Jay Powell's going to be one of the best. That guy is so slippery. He'll come right out of that news faster than you can imagine. There'll be something that he'll say, we couldn't see this coming.
Yeah, I think they need to pay attention to what that voter in Michigan said. He said, "Stop looking at the stock market. Stop looking at the headline GDP number, the payroll report. Start paying attention to homelessness, joblessness, the price of goods and groceries, incomes that don't keep up." I think that's the ultimate advice here from this one person in Michigan, and it's widely shared across the entire electorate. Start listening to these people because they're telling you there is no boom.
And that's Eurodollar University, folks, when we riff on the economy and are called heretics.
That's right.